everyone. This series of videos now is going to be on going back to conditionals, and in this video I'm going to start by talking about the language that we can use to also describe conditionals, only if sufficient conditions and necessary conditions. Let's get into it.
So we've done some stuff with conjunctions recently. That's going to be on quiz 3. The stuff here for this new stuff on conditionals is also going to be stuff for quiz 3 as well. Basically, one new rule is going to be introduced, but also there's going to be some translation stuff that I want you to know at this point too. So first of all, let's talk about the notion of an arrow. Now here's what we've said so far. Basically, it works this way. We got if, and then whatever follows if goes on the left side of the arrow. Then we got the arrow, and then sometimes we have the word then. It's not always there. And whatever is there goes on the right side of the arrow. So if I said something like if A, comma, B, the way we translate that is A, arrow, B. Because whatever follows the word if goes on the left side of the arrow. Okay, great. Now, let's take a look at this again, recognizing some of the parts. So I'm going to introduce some new terms here too. So here's our conditional again. So we got A, arrow, B, and I could put whatever letters here that I wanted to. First thing, here is the, and I've been using this word sometimes, the technical word for the left side of the arrow, no matter what its size is the antecedent. Antecedent. Literally, that's Latin, the thing that came before. That's why it's on the left side of the arrow. And technically, the right side of the arrow is the consequent, as in like consequences. Literally, consequent, the thing that came afterwards. Literally, the thing that came before, the thing that came afterward. That's pretty easy. Sometimes I've even used those terms. The left side of the arrow, the antecedent. The right side of the arrow, the consequent. So far, that hasn't been a big deal. Here's where it is a big deal. All right, in terms of these terms, sometimes the following terms will be used in an argument, and you need to know, hey, this means it's the left side. The word if might not be in there, or it's some of its synonyms that we've already talked about, like should and when. Sometimes this. So here are two terms that are synonyms for these respectively. Okay, so another word for, or another phrase for the antecedent is the phrase sufficient condition. And sometimes we could just say sufficient. Like when we say something's insufficient, we're saying, hey, you get A, arrow, B. Can we get B? Not without the A. Well, I don't have an A. Well, then you don't have the sufficient condition. You have insufficient means to unlock this B right now. Hey, I've got this though. Can I get B now? Yeah, because of arrow out. That's sufficient. Okay, so that's even why we even call that the sufficient condition. So if something is a sufficient condition, that means it's the left side of the arrow. Okay, and I'll look at a couple of examples here in a moment. Now, another term or phrase for the consequent is the necessary condition. So if something's on the right side of the arrow, it must follow. If a conditional statement is true, if one thing really leads to another thing, all right, let's say A stands for today is Monday, and let's say B stands for tomorrow is Tuesday. I put this together. If I say A, arrow, B, one way of saying it is if today is Monday, then tomorrow is Tuesday. Another way I could say it is if today is Monday, necessarily, it must be true that tomorrow is Tuesday. So that right side of the arrow has the sense of mustness or necessity to it. It must follow. It's not kind of like a maybe. It doesn't work that way. Right sides of the arrows are necessary. Sometimes you could use the word essential. I think in generally philosophy, that's probably not a good word to employ here for a necessary condition, but I've seen it be done to say like that this thing is essential. In fact, we'll see it in one of the examples from the book later on. But what this means is, when it comes to this stuff, is that somebody can use the following kinds of expressions when they're talking. Someone could say something like A is a sufficient condition. So A is a sufficient condition for B. How would I write that out? A, arrow, B. The thing that is the sufficient condition, what's the sufficient condition? A. The sufficient condition goes on the left side of the arrow. On the other hand, the necessary condition goes on the right side of the arrow. So if I said B is a necessary condition for A, how would I write that out? Well, necessary conditions go on the right side of the arrow. What is the necessary condition here? B is. So B goes on the right side of the arrow for A. So these two things are actually, I'm saying the exact same thing. If I say A is a sufficient condition for B, if I say B is a necessary condition for A, that's actually the same thing as saying if A, then B. Now there's another phrase here that I want to look out for as well. The dreaded only if. Let's take a look at it. Okay, to review what I've got so far. So the left side of the arrow, that can also be called this thing here. The left side of the arrow can also be referred to as a sufficient condition. And so I could say here A is a sufficient condition for B. I could also, and that's the left side here. Left sides are called sufficient conditions. Right sides of arrows, on the other hand, another name for them is necessary condition. And I'll say the main place where I see this kind of talk, necessary condition, sufficient condition, in my experience, come up the most are like legal contracts. You know, when you like download software or go to a website, we use cookies, and you click I agree. Anytime you do those things where you do like let me scroll down and click I agree. Usually that kind of stuff, if you do look at it, actually has this necessary and sufficient language, like what is sufficient cause for you being able to sue them, or saying like necessarily now that you've clicked I agree, you can't sue us for any reason, stuff like that. But that's where you'll see that lingo the most, this kind of stuff, because otherwise it's kind of a weird way to talk. Okay, we, like I said, usually use I could say if A, then B. Here's another way I could put this. So again, here's 4 ways I could put this. Let me start with the ones we know. If A, then B. Whatever A and B stand for. I could say A is, and I'm going to abbreviate here, A is a sufficient condition for B. How would I write that? Same thing, A or B. I could say B is a necessary condition for A. How would I write that? Same thing, A or B. Here's another way I could write this. I could write A only if B. What? Now, look, this is a phrase that gets really confusing. Only if. It looks like, well, hey, you said whatever follows if goes on the left side of the arrow. Why isn't B on the left side of the arrow? Now, this is a very special case, and I kept saying the phrase if. Right, that's because there's this phrase, only if. And you've heard it before. It really shows up in mathematics and sometimes very specific kinds of language. Usually when we employ it, we're actually using it correctly. We just don't think about it too hard. Basically, whatever follows only if is actually the right side of the arrow. Okay, and so here's the easiest way to not screw this up. As soon as you see only if you ever see something like A only if B, here's how not to screw it up. As soon as you see, not if by itself, but you see the phrase only if, just draw an arrow right over it, like this, that goes to the right. Okay, do that. So you see only if, just go, nope, what that means is there's an arrow pointing to the right, and that arrow is going to go right there, and you will never mess this up. Don't do that when you see if. Like when it comes to this stuff, whatever follows if, that goes on the left side of the arrow. You see only if, just replace it, draw an arrow right over it. Well, is it if or only? Don't even think about it. As soon as you see only if, just pop an arrow right over it. Now, on the other hand, if you see this phrase, if only, that is just regular if. This only is just there for fun. Just the phrase only if, in that order, you see it, you just replace it with an arrow, because what it's designating is whatever follows it is actually the necessary condition, which means the only if is preceding the right side of the arrow. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. All right, let's take a look at my first example here. We've got 2 simple statements. This is conjoined together here in this. Here's what we got. Being in the city of Aiken. That's just C. Being in South Carolina. 2 words, but remember, go with the first letter of the capitalized word. So S is going to stand for being in South Carolina. C here stands for being in the city of Aiken. It says this: being in the city of Aiken is a sufficient condition for being in South Carolina. So sufficient condition, that means 1, there's an arrow, and whatever the thing is that is a sufficient condition goes on the left side of the arrow. So sufficient conditions always go on the left side, period. So here, what is the sufficient condition? Being in the city of Aiken. Bam, C. Is a sufficient condition for what? Being in South Carolina. That is just going to be S. So the compound statement, being in the city of Aiken, is a sufficient condition for being in South Carolina, is the same thing as saying, if you're in the city of Aiken, then you're in South Carolina. But notice that does not work the other way around. So here's an arrow that we're not getting out of this. This does not say if you're in South Carolina, then you're in Aiken. That doesn't make any sense. That's stupid talk. Well, I'm in Charleston. Well, then you're in South Carolina, you must be in Aiken. No, so it doesn't work this way. All right, I'm not saying that when I say that something is a sufficient condition. Sufficient conditions go on the left side of the arrows. They're the same. This is another, you could say a more expensive way of saying the word if. All right, so if you're in the city of Aiken, then you're in South Carolina is the same thing as saying being in the city of Aiken is a sufficient condition for being in South Carolina. I guess I could also say with this one, I could say being in South Carolina is a necessary condition of being in the city of Aiken, which means if you're in Aiken, then necessarily you must be in South Carolina. I can think of maybe a few places right on the Savannah River where you technically might be in part of Aiken County, I guess. I guess that's not the city of Aiken. So we'll just say for our purposes here, if you're in the city of Aiken, then you're in South Carolina. That's what this is saying. Let's take a look at another one. Let's take a look at another example. This one. Having at least a 60% average is a necessary condition for passing the class. Okay, so here, it's an arrow anytime we got sufficient or necessary conditions, because remember, these arrows, they're called conditional statements. They're conditionals. Here we got an arrow, and necessary conditions go on the right. So always, sufficient conditions go on the left, necessary conditions go on the right. So what is the necessary condition here? So we need to find what is the necessary condition. Having at least a 60% average is a necessary condition. There it is. This thing's going on the right side of the arrow. So having at least a 60% average goes on the right side of the arrow. It's a necessary condition for what? Passing the class. It gets us P arrow A, which means me saying this, having at least a 60% average is a necessary condition for passing the class, is another way of saying if you pass the class, then you must have had a 60% average at least. Okay, or you must have had, notice that necessary condition, that must have. If you passed, then you must have made a 60 or greater. If you passed the class, then necessarily you made a 60% or greater. Okay, I guess I could also say passing the class, this is a weird way of talking, passing the class is a sufficient condition for having an average of at least 60 or greater. I could say that here. That one sounds kind of sloppy, so I actually think the necessary condition one here works best. Alright, now let's take a look at this compound statement here that's made up of two simple statements. You'll be permitted on campus, that's P. P, you'll be permitted on campus. W, you wear a mask. They're put together with this only if. So what do we do with only if? This is what I said to do. As soon as you see only if, just draw an arrow right over it, pointing to the right, and you'll never mess it up. So now what does it say? P arrow W, yep, that's it. You could say wearing a mask is a necessary condition of being permitted on campus. That is, if you're here, then you got to be wearing one. We could say that in a couple of different ways. But yeah, only if, don't overthink it. Just as soon as you see it, draw an arrow right over it, and that's how you can make sure that you nail it every single time. So let's take a look at my shorthand here for this. So here's basically, I have a little model here of how I think you can remember this. Here's what I'm going to do of the new three things here: sufficient condition, necessary condition, only if. Here's how I remember it. I'm going to write only if here. So here's the deal. When you see only if, I said what to do is draw an arrow right over it. Okay? Where do sufficient conditions go? On the left side of the arrow. Where do necessary conditions go? On the right side of the arrow. So this right here, this is my little quiz 3 diagram for this stuff. Here's all you needed to know. Like, just know this diagram for this. For everything that I've talked about, at least in this video so far. Sufficient conditions go on the left. Necessary conditions go on the right side of the arrow, and when you see only if, just draw an arrow right over it. So it's as simple as this diagram right here.
So that was an introduction to some of the terminology that we can use with conditionals: only if, necessary condition, sufficient condition. What I'm going to do in the next video is I'm going to start going over some additional stuff that we can do with conditionals, namely conditional proof. See you next time.